Hello, my friends. Before we get into it, please hit the subscribe button and drop a like. I'd appreciate it a lot as it contributes to the growth of this channel. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments also. Now, close your eyes, get comfortable, relax, and let the story unfold through me. The fire towers were always quiet at night. Perched high above the forest, they offered a view that stretched for miles, rolling hills, endless trees, and, on clear nights like this, the scattered glow of distant towns along the horizon. My station at Fire Tower 17 was one of the few still in active use, a relic of an era when lookouts were manned year-round. Before drones and satellites took over most of the fire surveillance work, I leaned against the railing, staring out into the darkness. The forest stretched in every direction, a vast sea of black beneath the pale light of the morn. The wind moved through the trees in slow, whispering waves, carrying the familiar scent of pine and damp earth. A faint rustling drifted up from below the sound of something moving through the underbrush, probably a deer, or something smaller. I checked my watch. 11:37 p.m. The shift had been uneventful so far. No smoke on the horizon, no signs of trouble. Just another quiet night in the middle of nowhere. Then the radio crackled. The sound startled me not because it was unexpected, but because of the frequency it was coming from. I reached for the handset, my fingers tightening around the worn plastic. The voice on the other end was faint, distorted by static, but I could just make out the words. Tower 9 to 17. Do you copy? My stomach tensed. Fire Tower 9 had been decommissioned years ago. I hesitated, listening to the dead air that followed. The transmission had been short, uncertain, as if the speaker wasn't sure the message would even go through. I pressed the call button, my voice steady. This is Tower 17. Who's calling? Silence. A few seconds passed. Then, Tower 9 to 17. Do you copy? The exact same message. The same tone. The same pause between words. A recording? No. It had been distorted differently this time, the static shifting slightly between syllables. I exhaled slowly, glancing out over the forest. From my position, I could just make out the dark outline of Fire Tower 9 in the distance, barely visible through the trees. A forgotten shell of rusted metal and broken glass. No one had been stationed there in years. No one should have been using its radio. I pressed the call button again. Tower 9, your frequency is not in use. Identify yourself. No response. I set the radio back on the table, frowning. Probably interference. It wasn't unheard of for old equipment to pick up stray signals, though I had never experienced it on a dead frequency before. I turned back toward the railing, casting one last glance toward the distant silhouette of Tower 9. That was when I saw them. Lights. Moving through the trees. At first, I thought they were fireflies' tiny specks of orange and white drifting between the trunks. But fireflies didn't move like that. They weren't erratic. They weren't shifting, circling, weaving in and out of the darkness like something aware of being watched. I reached for the binoculars, lifting them to my eyes. The forest came into sharp focus, the distant glow flickering between the trees. The lights weren't firefly. They were too big, fluting just above the ground. They moved in slow, deliberate patterns, never straying too far from the base of Tower 9. Their glow pulsed, like embers being stirred, and I could just barely make out the shadows of the trees shifting unnaturally in their wake. My chest tightened. This was wrong. No hikers should have been out there this late. No lanterns, no flashlights, no possible explanation for the movement below. I lowered the binoculars, stepping back from the railing. My first instinct was to report it. A potential wildfire hazard. Unauthorized personnel in a restricted area both warranted an immediate call. I reached for the radio again, my fingers hovering over the frequency dial. Then, a new transmission. Soft, too close. Tower 9 to 17. Do you copy? The voice hadn't come from the radio this time. It had come from the trees, somewhere far below me. The air in the tower shifted, the temperature dropping just slightly. A cold pressure settled against the base of my skull, a feeling I couldn't quite explain. I gripped the radio, my breath coming slow and careful. There was no one at Tower 9. There hadn't been in years. I turned toward the stairs, my boots scuffing against the wooden planks. My flashlight was still clipped to my belt, the weight of it reassuring. If someone was down there, I had to see. I had to confirm. I moved carefully, each step steady and controlled. The fire tower's metal supports groaned slightly as I descended, the cold night air wrapping around me. The ground stretched wide at the base of the tower, a mix of gravel and flattened earth leading into the tree line. I paused at the last step, scanning the darkness ahead. The lights were gone. The forest was silent. I inhaled through my nose, my breath slow and steady. I took a step forward, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the night. The trees swayed gently in the wind, their leaves whispering against one another, but nothing else moved. Then, a fitter. Not in the trees, not in the distance. Above me, I froze. The light had shifted, not from the forest floor, not from Tower 9. It was above Fire Tower 17, circling the top. I turned sharply, heart pounding. The glow moved against the night sky, not chaotic, not frantic just watching. I took a slow step backward, my breath catching in my throat. Then, the radio in my hand crackled to life. A voice, the same voice, the same exact tone I had used earlier. This is Tower 17. Who's calling? The words repeated, perfectly mimicked. Then, after a long pause, a whisper, my own voice. Help me. The transmission cut out. I didn't move. I couldn't move. The glow above the tower pulsed, flickering once, then disappearing entirely. The silence stretched long, the darkness pressing in from all sides. The fire tower loomed above me, empty, or at least it should have been. I stood frozen at the base of Fire Tower 17, gripping the radio so tightly my knuckles ached. The last transmission still echoed in my skull-my-own voice, repeating the words I had spoken just minutes before. Help me. The night air pressed in around me, cold and unmoving. The glow that had been circling the tower was gone now, swallowed into the dark like it had never existed. But I knew it had. I had seen it. I had heard it. And I wasn't alone. I forced myself to move, taking a slow step backward toward the stairs. The beam of my flashlight trembled slightly in my grip, sweeping across the empty forest floor. Nothing moved between the trees. No figures. No lights. But the silence was wrong. The wind had died completely. The usual rustling of leaves, the distant calls of nocturnal birds, the low hum of the forest at night, all of it was gone. I exhaled slowly, my breath loud in the absolute stillness. I needed to get back inside, I climbed the stairs carefully, my boots heavy against the wooden steps. The tower groaned slightly under my weight, the metal supports shifting against the cold. I kept my flashlight trained ahead, scanning every shadow, every possible movement. The top platform came into view. The door to the observation deck stood open, just as I had left it. The glow from my desk lamp spilled onto the floor, a small pool of warmth in the otherwise empty space. I stepped inside and locked the door behind me. The air in the room felt thick, like the lingering pressure of something unseen. I set my flashlight down on the table, my fingers still stiff from the cold. The radio set silent now, the frequency unchanged. I reached for the dial. No interference, no static. The only sound was the faint hum of the tower settling in the wind. I leaned forward, pressing the call button. My voice came out lower than I intended, rough with unease. Dispatch, this is Fire Tower 17. I have received unauthorized transmissions from Fire Tower 9, requesting confirmation of any personnel in that area. I released the button, waiting. A long stretch of static filled the line. Then, copy, 17. No personnel assigned to Fire Tower 9. I swallowed hard, gripping the edge of the table. Understood. Have there been any reports of unauthorized hikers near that location? A pause. Then negative. No reports of movement in that sector. Are you requesting backup? I hesitated. I wanted to say yes. I wanted someone else to be here, to confirm that I wasn't imagining things. Though what would I even tell them? That I had seen lights moving through the trees? That I had heard my own voice over the radio? That something had been watching me from the treetops? I exhaled, forcing my pulse to slow. Negative. I'll check the area at first light. Copy. 17. Keep us updated. The line went dead. I leaned back in my chair, rubbing my temples. My body was still on high alert, my muscles tight, my nerves stretched thin. I had been alone up here for weeks. Nothing had felt off before tonight. So why now? I glanced toward the window. The forest was empty. The sky stretched wide and clear above it, the moon casting pale light over the treetops. I watched for movement. Nothing. Just as I was about to turn away, something caught my eye. Not in the trees, in the glass. My breath stalled. My reflection. It was standing in the window, staring back at me. But something was wrong. The posture wasn't mine. The way it stood too rigid, too still. In the eyes I felt my pulse hammer against my ribs. I turned sharply. Nothing was there. The night stretched empty beyond the window. My reflection had returned to normal. I exhaled sharply, running a hand down my face. My skin was damp with sweat despite the cold. My pulse was still erratic, my breath uneven. I was exhausted. That had to be it. Just exhaustion. I pushed away from the desk, my chair scraping against the floor. I needed sleep. A few hours of rest, and I'd be able to make sense of all this in the morning. I moved to the cot in the corner, lowering myself onto the thin mattress. The wind outside had picked up again, the trees whispering against one another, the night returning to something almost normal. I closed my eyes, forcing my body to relax. Then, the radio clicked. My breath caught. I didn't move. Static hummed through the speaker, low and rhythmic. Then, a whisper. Faint, distant, not from the radio. From the stairs. I sat up sharply, my pulse slamming through my veins. The room was deathly still, the air thick with something unseen. The whisper came again, soft, crawling up the steps. I reached for my flashlight, my grip unsteady. I turned toward the door, straining to hear the whisper stopped. The silence that followed was worse. A cold dread settled into my stomach. I stood slowly, moving toward the door. My breath was loud, too loud, in the absolute quiet. I placed my hand against the wood, hesitated. Then, just as I was about to open it, something knocked. Once, twice, 3 times. My blood turned to ice. I didn't breathe, didn't move. The knocks had been soft, not forceful, not frantic, just patient, waiting. I took a step back, my chest tight, my fingers curled around the handle of my flashlight. The knocking didn't come again. Instead, the radio crackled, and through the static my voice, "Help me!" The same exact words, the same tone, perfectly mimicked. The air in the tower grew heavier, pressing in from all sides. The light from my lamp flickered, the wind outside stopped, and in the window, a reflection, standing behind me. The radio hissed, stretching into silence. I turned, and the door unlocked itself. The lock clicked open with an unnatural softness, the sound barely audible over the low hum of the radio static. I stood completely still, my breath caught in my throat, my fingers locked around the handle of my flashlight. The door hadn't moved, but the lock had on its own. A slow wave of dread settled deep in my bones. Outside, the night stretched still and empty. No wind, no rustling leaves, no distant calls of animals moving through the forest. And in the glass of the window, just behind my shoulder, a reflection that wasn't mine. I spun, the flashlight beam cutting through the dim room, my pulse slamming against my ribs. Nothing. I exhaled sharply, my breath coming fast and shallow. The weight of exhaustion pressed against me, but I pushed it down. I couldn't afford to be tired now. Not with ***, whatever this was *** happening. I turned toward the door again, my muscles tense. The metal latch was unhooked, the lock undone. Had I forgotten to secure it? No. I was certain I had locked it when I came back up. The air in the tower felt thicker, pressing in from all sides. I reached out slowly, fingers brushing against the cool metal handle, my ears straining for any sound from the stairs below. Silence. Then a whisper, right outside the door. I yanked my hand back as if burned, every nerve in my body screaming. My grip tightened on the flashlight, my knuckles aching from the pressure. The whisper hadn't been loud. It had been soft, almost careful, like it was waiting for something. I stepped back, forcing my breath to slow. My mind scrambled for logic, for an answer. Someone was playing a prank. Had to be. Maybe a lost hiker messing with the tower. Maybe a rogue transmission from an old frequency. But neither of those explanations accounted for the lights in the trees, or the thing in the reflection. The radio crackled again. This time, the static was different. It didn't stretch endlessly, didn't hiss in the same rhythmic pattern. It breathed, a slow inhale, a slow exhale. Too deep, too steady. I moved toward the radio, my hand hovering over the dial. I had to say something. I had to break whatever loop this was. I pressed the call button, forcing my voice to stay steady. Who is this? Silence. Then, through the static, you were here before. The words sent an immediate chill through me. I took a slow step back, my breath uneven. The response had been distorted, stretched thin beneath the weight of interference, but I knew what I had heard. I pressed the button again. Tower 9, identify yourself. No response. I turned back toward the door, my heartbeat hammering. The whisper was gone now, but the lock was still open. The weight in my chest grew heavier. I had two choices. I could open the door, step out onto the deck, shine my light down the stairs, confirm that nothing was there. Or I could stay inside, pretend I hadn't heard the whisper, lock the door, the game, wait until morning. Neither option felt safe. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to move. I stepped forward, pressing my palm against the door, hesitating only for a second before pushing it open. The hinges creaked softly. The cold air hit me instantly, sharp and biting against my skin. The trees stretched endless and dark beyond the tower, shifting faintly in the wind. I stepped out onto the deck, my boots heavy against the wooden planks. The beam of my flashlight swept downward, cutting through the darkness. The stairs were empty. The ground below was undisturbed. No movement. No footprints in the dirt. Nothing. I exhaled, the knot in my stomach tightening instead of easing. I turned back toward the forest, scanning the tree line. The lights were gone, but I could feel that somewhere, unseen, they were watching. I stepped back inside, closing the door behind me. This time, I slid the lock back into place, double-checking it before stepping away. The radio was still on, but the breathing had stopped. Everything was quiet again. I sat down at the desk, rubbing my temples. I needed sleep. A few hours, just enough to clear my head, to make sense of things in the morning. I stretched out on the cot, exhaling slowly. The wind picked up outside, rustling through the trees, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine through the cracks in the tower walls. I closed my eyes. The last thing I heard before I drifted into uneasy sleep was the faint click of the radio turning itself back on, and the whisper. You were here before. The night stretched long, heavy with silence. The wind outside had picked up again, rattling the windows, carrying with it the distant scent of damp pine and something else, something faintly metallic, like smoldering embers buried deep beneath the earth. I slept, but it wasn't restful. It was the kind of sleep that felt like falling, the kind where you wake up gasping, reaching for something that isn't there. And when my eyes finally opened, the first thing I heard was the radio. Clicking on, I jolted upright, breath still caught in my throat. The cot creaked beneath me, the thin mattress stiff against my back. The radio crackled, a soft hum of static drifting through the room. Then, a whisper. It's almost time. The words slid through the interference like something wet and crawling. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to move. My body felt heavy, my limbs stiff. The air inside the tower was different, now thicker, pressing in from all sides. I reached for the radio, fingers hovering over the call button. My breath came slow and careful. Who is this? The static stretched. Then you were here before. A pulse of ice spread through my chest. The same words. Again. I turned toward the window. The first hint of dawn was bleeding into the horizon, pale and cold. The sky above the trees was gray, the forest below stretching dark and endless. Something moved, a flicker in the trees. I grabbed my flashlight, stepping cautiously toward the glass. The forest was still, save for the wind shifting through the branches. Then, a light, not fire, not a reflection. Something moving through the trees, The same lights I had seen the night before, only now they were closer, circling the base of Fire Tower 17. I inhaled sharply, my pulse hammering against my ribs. My first instinct was to call it in, to reach for the radio and alert dispatch, but something in my gut told me that wouldn't do any good. Who would believe me? What would I even say? I grabbed my binoculars instead, lifting them to my eyes. The lenses brought the shapes into sharp focus. The lights floated just above the forest floor, weaving in and out of the trees with slow, deliberate movements. They weren't random. They were searching. I adjusted the focus, scanning the area. Then, a figure, standing just beyond the tree line, still, watching. My breath caught. The details sharpened, the binoculars pulling the shape into focus. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. He was tall, dressed in what used to be a ranger's uniform, but the fabric was wrong-faded, almost brittle. The colors washed out like it had been left in the sun for decades. And his face, I couldn't see it. It was blurred, like staring at something through a layer of smoke, edges shifting, never fully forming. I lowered the binoculars, my breath coming hard and fast. The lights flickered again, pulsing softly against the trees. I looked back through the lenses. The man was gone. The forest stretched empty before me, the lights fading, flickering out one by one. I exhaled, stepping away from the window. My hands were shaking, my skin damp with sweat. I had to go down there. I knew it was a bad idea. Every part of me screamed against it, but I had to see. I had to know. I grabbed my jacket, slinging my radio over my shoulder, my flashlight tight in my grip. The stairs creaked beneath my boots as I descended, the cold morning air wrapping around me like a warning. The forest stood quiet, too quiet. The lights had vanished completely now, swallowed by the growing dawn, but something lingered in the air, something unseen, pressing at the edges of my vision. I stepped onto the dirt, my breath coming slow and steady. The ground was undisturbed. No footprints, no signs that anyone had been here. But I had seen him. I had seen something. I moved toward the trees, scanning between the trunks. My flashlight beam cut through the early morning fog, illuminating patches of undergrowth, but nothing else. No movement, no sound. Then something crunched, not beneath my feet, behind me. I turned sharply, flashlight swinging toward the noise. Nothing. The air was still, but my footprints were gone. The ground behind me was undisturbed, like I had never walked here at all. A deep, slow dread settled into my stomach. I stepped backward, scanning the clearing. My pulse roared in my ears, my fingers clenched tight around the flashlight. Then a radio click, soft, right next to me. I froze. The speaker on my vest crackled, the static stretching. Then my own voice. Help me. A sharp pulse of fear ran through me. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The words repeated. The exact same inflection, the exact same tone, perfectly mimicked. I turned, my breath caught in my throat. The figure was standing in front of me now, closer than before, still blur, still watching. The air around it shimmered, like heat rising from pavement, distorting the space it occupied. The glow beneath its skin pulsed, flickering faintly. My legs locked in place. The radio crackled again. And, in my voice, you were here before. I took a slow step back, my body screaming to run. The figure didn't move, but the air shifted, like something unseen had just stepped closer. The wind died, The forest held its breath. Then the figure opened its mouth, and in my own voice, "It's almost time." The trees around me blurred, the ground tilting slightly beneath my feet. A deep, slow vibration crawled through the air, pressing against my skin. The fire tower loomed behind me, empty, but I wasn't alone. The lights flickered back to life, and they were closer this time. The lights pulsed in slow, rhythmic patterns, their glow bleeding through the trees like distant embers. They had been moving before shifting, searching, but now they were closer. I forced my breath to stay steady, my pulse hammering against my ribs. The figure that had spoken in my own voice was gone now, as if it had never been there at all. But I still felt it. The air around me was thick with something unseen, something pressing against the edges of reality like a weight settling over the world. The forest should have been waking up by now, the sounds of birds, of movement in the brush. But everything remained unnervingly silent. I took a slow step back toward the tower, my flashlight still trained on the trees. The lights didn't vanish this time. They hovered waiting. I had seen strange things in the wilderness before. I had found footprints where no one should have been. I'd heard sounds in the dead of night that had no source, but asterisk, this asterisk, this was something entirely different. I reached for my radio. The second my fingers brushed against the speaker, it clicked on. No static this time. No delay. Just a voice. My voice. "You were here before." The words sent a slow, creeping dread through me, curling around my ribs like something tangible. I pressed the call button, my voice rough. "Tower 17 to dispatch. Do you copy?" Silence. Then, a reply. "We haven't received any calls tonight." The response was too fast, too perfect. I gritted my teeth, gripping the radio tighter. Who is this? The lights in the trees flickered. Then, over the radio, "Help me." The same exact way I had said it before. The same tone, the same hesitation, the same sharp edge of fear. Something wasn't right. I turned toward the tower, quickening my pace. My boots hit the wooden steps with purpose, every instinct screaming at me to get higher, to get off the ground. I reached the top platform, stepping inside, slamming the door behind me. The lock clicked into place. The air in the tower was heavy, charged with something electric, something unseen. I stood in the dim glow of my desk lamp, gripping the edge of the table. What was I supposed to do? Report it? Call? For backup? Who would believe me? The logs. I turned sharply, moving toward the filing cabinet in the corner of the tower. Years of ranger reports were stored here: incident logs, wildlife documentation, Sir Chandrescu reports. I yanked open one of the drawers, fingers skimming through pages, looking for anything that could explain this. Then, a familiar name. Fire Tower 9. My pulse skipped. I pulled the report free, scanning the text. The handwriting was neat, methodical. A ranger had filed this over 30 years ago. He had been stationed here, at Tower 17. The details made my stomach tighten. Unidentified lights seen moving through the trees near Fire Tower 9. Radio interference on decommissioned frequency. Received a distress call from Tower 9, no personnel assigned. Caller's voice matched my own. The words blurred. I flipped the page. The final entry was different. The handwriting had changed, messier, more erratic, as if written in a hurry. Something is wrong. The lights are closer tonight. The radio keeps repeating my voice. There's someone else here. I swallowed hard. The entry was dated exactly 1 year before the ranger vanished. No body was ever found. Only his truck and his radio, still turned on, still playing his voice. A wave of nausea rolled through me. I set the papers down, exhaling slowly. I turned back toward the window. The lights were gone. The trees were dark. The night stretched empty once more. But I knew better. They were still watching. I just couldn't see them for now. The forest had returned to darkness, but I knew the lights hadn't disappeared. They were still out there, watching from the unseen spaces between the trees. I paced the small tower cabin, my boots scuffing against the wooden floor. My pulse hadn't slowed. My breathing was still uneven. I forced myself to take a deep inhale, but it didn't help. The report I had found still sat open on my desk. I scanned the words again, trying to make sense of them, trying to rationalize them against what I had seen. But there was no rational explanation. This had happened before, and now it was happening again. I turned back toward the window. The fire tower's vantage point stretched high above the trees, giving me a clear view of the surrounding forest. In daylight, it would be breathtaking, but at night, it was just an endless abyss. I lifted my binoculars, scanning the tree line. If the lights returned, I wanted to see them first. The lenses focused, sharpening the details below. I swept the area north, east, toward the ridge, then further, beyond the clearing, toward where Fire Tower 9 sat, abandoned. And then, a flicker. I adjusted the focus, my breath catching in my throat. Something was standing inside the tower. I froze. The observation deck of Fire Tower 9 was barely visible through the trees, but I could see movement. A figure, still as stone, watching me from across the vast stretch of forest. My skin went cold. I shifted the binoculars slightly, trying to make out details. The shape was human tall, unmoving, but the light was too dim to make out a face. Then, just as I exhaled, it moved, a slow, unnatural tilt of the head, a recognition, like it knew I was watching. I lowered the binoculars, my pulse hammering. I blinked, my brain scrambling to process what I had just seen. When I lifted the binoculars again, the figure was gone. A wave of nausea rolled through me. I stumbled back from the window, gripping the edge of the desk. I had to call it in. I reached for the radio, my fingers cold. I pressed the call button, my voice steadier than I felt. "Dispatch, this is Tower 17. Do you copy?" Static. Then a response. "We haven't received any calls tonight." My stomach turned. The same exact words as before. Too fast. Too identical. I swallowed hard, my breath coming short and shallow. "I need confirmation. Has anyone been in Fire Tower 9? Another pause. Then, from the radio, "Help me." My own voice. I yanked my hand away from the speaker as if it had burned me. The words rang through the cabin, bouncing against the walls, filling every inch of the space with something wrong. Something had used my voice. Something was listening. I took a slow step back, my entire body rigid. The air inside the tower felt different now, heavier, like I wasn't alone. The wind outside had died again. The trees had gone completely still. The forest had returned to its unnatural silence, pressing against the fire tower like a weight. Then, a creak. Not from the radio, not from outside, from inside the cabin. My blood turned to ice. I turned slowly, flashlight trembling in my grip. The beam swept over the room, illuminating the cot, the desk, the filing cabinet. Nothing. I forced myself to take a breath. I was alone. And then the reflection in the window changed. My pulse stopped. I was still staring into the glass, my own face looking back at me, but it wasn't mine. The posture was off, the stance too rigid, the shoulders too still. And then the mouth moved. Without me. My breath caught in my throat. I took an instinctive step back. The reflection didn't. It smiled. The slow, stretched grin of something that wasn't human. The light in the cabin flickered. I spun around, my body locked in pure survival mode. My breath came hard and fast, panic rising in my chest like a flood. I had to get out. I grabbed my pack, my fingers fumbling for the door handle. My mind screamed at me to move, to get out. The second my hand touched the handle, the lights went out. I was swallowed in total darkness. The wind outside was gone. The radio had gone silent. The entire fire tower hummed with something unseen, something pressing against the walls, pressing into my skull. And in the pitch-black room, a whisper, so close. "You were here before." I shoved the door open, stepping onto the deck, gasping in the sharp night air. The flashlight beam cut across the railing, the distant forest stretching into shadows. The lights in the trees were back. Only now, they weren't hovering in the distance. They were moving toward me. I gritted my teeth, gripping the railing, forcing myself to breathe. The fire tower was high. I was safe. I was above it. Then, from below, a single, deliberate knock. It came from the stairs. My stomach twisted. The knock came again. Then another. Something was coming up. The knocks weren't rushed. They weren't frantic. They were steady, controlled. I took a step back toward the door, heart slamming against my ribs. My flashlight beam wavered, shaking in my grip. The knocking stopped. A long silence stretched through the night. Then a shadow moved at the base of the stairs. I raised the flashlight. For a split second, I saw something tall, too tall, standing at the bottom of the stairs, watching me. The glow from the trees flickered again, illuminating the figure for just a breath, and I saw its face. Not its own. Mine. The figure at the base of the stairs stood motionless, its body too still, too deliberate-like. It was waiting for me to acknowledge it. The glow from the trees pulsed, stretching shadows across the ground, casting its face-me, face-in flickering, unnatural light. A deep, primal dread settled into my bones. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The only sound was the faint hum of the night, the rhythmic pulse of the lights moving ever closer through the trees. The thing at the bottom of the stairs tilted its head just slightly, the exact same way the figure had done in Fire Tower 9, like it was trying to understand me. I swallowed hard, forcing my pulse to slow, my grip tightening around the flashlight. My mind screamed at me to run, to lock myself inside the tower, to do anything but stand here and stare. But some deeper instinct told me that movement was a mistake, that this thing, this copy, was testing me, and if I failed, if I panicked, it would come closer. I exhaled through my nose, slow and steady. My muscles were tight, my entire body locked into place, every nerve screaming to act, but I stayed still. The figure remained where it was. Then, without warning, it took a step up the stairs. The wooden plank creaked beneath its weight, the sound sharp and deliberate. My breath hitched, the flashlight beam wavered slightly in my grip. I didn't dare lower it. It took another step, and another, slow, steady, climbing toward me. The lights in the forest flickered, their pulsing glow reflecting off the metal railings of the fire tower. The air around me was thick, pressing against my chest, making every breath feel labored. I forced my voice to stay calm, controlled. Stay where you are. The thing stopped, dead still, halfway up the stairs. My own face stared back at me, blank and unreadable. The mouth moved. No sound came out. Then a whisper. Not from the figure. From my radio. Let me in. A cold shock of terror shot through me. I reached for my radio, but my fingers froze. The figure took another step. The whisper on the radio came again, softer. Let me in. The air in the tower shifted. The pressure around me changed, bending inward, pulling at me like something unseen had just stepped closer. I clenched my jaw. Who are you? The figure stopped moving. Then, in a voice identical to mine, you were here before. A deep, slow horror unfurled inside me. I took a step back toward the door, my muscles tense. The glow in the trees pulsed brighter. Then the lights vanished. The figure below was gone. The night returned to absolute stillness. I turned sharply, throwing the door open, stepping back inside the tower. I locked the door, my breath coming fast and unsteady. I pressed my back against the wall, gripping the flashlight so tightly my knuckles ached. My reflection stared back at me from the window. I was alone, or at least I should have been. I exhaled sharply, running a hand down my face. My skin was damp with sweat, my muscles still locked with tension. The logs. I had to check the logs again. I moved toward the desk, flipping open the reports. My eyes scanned the documents, searching for anything that made sense. Then a name, one I hadn't noticed before. A ranger stationed at Fire Tower 17 over 3 decades ago. He had gone missing, just like the others. And in his final report, before he vanished, there's someone else in the tower. It looks like me. My stomach turned. I flipped the page. The last entry wasn't his. The handwriting was mine. I stared at the page, my breath coming slow and uneven. The handwriting was mine. Every letter, every curve of inket was identical, but I had never written this. I hadn't been here 30 years ago. I swallowed against the growing tightness in my throat, my fingers stiff as I traced the words, my mind scrambling to make sense of them. How was this possible? Had someone copied my writing? Had I written this in some kind of trance, not remembering? Or had I been here before? The thoughts slithered into my skull like a parasite, curling deep, making my skin crawl. I forced myself to look away from the page. My body felt wrong, like my own limbs didn't belong to me. The tower was silent again. The only sound, the slow creak of the wind outside. I turned toward the window. The forest had returned to darkness. The lights were gone. But I still felt them, watching, waiting. I moved toward the radio, my hands steady despite the panic still gnawing at the edges of my mind. I had to call it in. I had to get someone else on the line. I pressed the button. Dispatch, this is Fire Tower 17. Do you read me? Silence. Then, a response. We haven't received any calls tonight. The exact same words, the exact same tone. I gritted my teeth. Who is this? Static hummed through the speaker. Then, my own voice. Help me. I let go of the radio. The weight in the air shifted. The pressure in the cabin grew heavier, pressing against my chest, pushing me down. Something was here. I turned toward the door. The wooden planks creaked under my boots. The lock was still in place, but I didn't trust it to hold. Not against whatever this was. I needed to go down there. I needed to see if there were any footprints left in the dirt, if there were any signs that I hadn't imagined at all. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped onto the deck. The cold air bit into my skin. The forest stretched silent and endless before me. The stairs spiraled downward, disappearing into the dark. I hesitated for only a moment. Then I descended. Each step groaned beneath my weight. The tower loomed above me, its skeletal frame cutting into the night sky. The ground was still damp from the evening's chill. My flashlight beam swept over the dirt. No footprints, no signs of movement, like nothing had ever been here. But I had seen it. I had heard it. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees, the distant ridge. The wind had picked up again, rustling the branches, carrying the faint scent of charred wood. Then a sound, soft, almost imperceptible, footsteps, not mine. I went completely still, my breath caught in my throat. They were coming from the other side of the tower. I stepped forward carefully, my boots pressing into the dirt. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, sweeping across the wooden supports of the tower's base, and then a shadow moved. I whipped the light toward it, my pulse slamming against my ribs. For a brief second, I saw something, a figure, standing exactly where I had been minutes ago. The same stance, the same height. The flashlight beam flickered. The figure stepped back into the dark, gone. A deep, twisting nausea coiled in my stomach. My hands were clammy against the flashlight's grip. It had been standing in my exact spot, watching, imitating. I forced my breathing to steady. My fingers hovered over the radio, debating whether to call it in. Would it even matter? Would the voice on the other end just be me again? I turned back toward the stairs, and then a whisper. Close, too close. You were here before. The light flickered. The trees shifted, and as I spun around, something stepped out of the darkness. It looked like me, but it wasn't. The thing standing in front of me was me. Same height, same build, same uniform. But the details were wrong. Its posture was too stiff, too still, like a photograph of a person instead of something alive. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, its shoulders squared too perfectly, and its face, it wasn't finished. The features were there, but blurred, like something had tried to recreate me from memory, but had gotten the small details wrong. The lines of my face weren't quite right. The eyes were too dark, too deep. I gripped the flashlight so tightly my knuckles ached. My pulse thundered against my ribs. My breath locked in my throat. Neither of us moved. It just watched, like it was waiting for me to do something first. I forced my voice to stay steady. What do you want? The air shifted. The thing's mouth opened, and my own voice came out. Help me. The same words, the same tone, the same exact inflection. I took a slow step back, my boots pressed into the dirt, the cold seeping through the fabric. The thing moved with me, perfectly synchronized. I stopped. It stopped. A deep, creeping horror crawled into my chest. It wasn't just mimicking me. It was learning. I clenched my jaw, keeping my breath slow and controlled. I knew somehow that if I reacted wrong, if I ran, if I panicked, it would follow. I exhaled, forcing my muscles to unlock. I needed to get back to the tower. I took a step toward the stairs. The thing didn't move this time. It just stood there, its head tilting slightly again, watching me go. I climbed the stairs deliberately, resisting the instinct to break into a full sprint. I could feel it down there, feel its presence pressing against my spine. I reached the top and stepped onto the deck. The door was still ajar from when I left it. I backed inside, keeping my eyes on the clearing below. It was still there, still watching. Then the radio clicked, a burst of static, slow and deliberate. Then, my own voice. "You can't leave." A pulse of ice shot through me. I gritted my teeth and pressed the call button. "Who is this?" Silence. Then, softer. "You were here before." The radio hissed, stretching into a low hum. The air in the tower changed. It felt occupied. I turned slowly, scanning the small space. The cot, the desk, the filing cabinet, all exactly where they should be. But something felt off. The window. I stepped toward it, my pulse hammering against my ribs. The reflection staring back at me wasn't mine. The body was, but the face wasn't. The features were still blurred, the details still wrong. The edges of the mouth too stretched, the eyes too hollow. I swallowed hard, gripping the edge of the desk. Then it moved. Not a twitch. Not a flicker. It waved. My stomach twisted violently. I spun away from the window, pressing my back against the desk, my breath coming too fast. The air around me pulsed heavy, charged, waiting. Then, over the radio, "Let me in." The lights outside flickered back to life. They weren't in the trees anymore. They were at the base of the tower, surrounding it. The glow crawled up the stairs. Closer. I braced myself, locking my legs, clenching my fists. I wasn't running. I wasn't letting it in. The whisper came again. "It's almost time." And then the lock on the door clicked open. The lock on the door clicked open with an unnatural smoothness, the sound barely more than a whisper against the still air. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The lights outside had crept their way up the tower, flickering along the wooden steps, pulsing like embers stirred from a dying fire. Their glow seeped in through the cracks in the walls, casting long, shifting shadows across the cabin. And the door was unlocked. By itself, I forced my fingers to unclench from around the flashlight. My pulse roared in my ears, but I knew, somehow, deep in my bones, that if I reacted wrong, if I so much as twitched toward the door, it would open further. I reached for the radio with slow, deliberate movements, keeping my eyes locked on the door. Static, a low, rhythmic hum. Then a voice. My voice. "You were here before." The air in the room felt heavier now, pressing against my chest, making every breath feel stolen. The door hadn't swung open yet, but I could feel it. A presence. Something just beyond the threshold. Something waiting. I swallowed hard, my voice steadier than I expected. "I don't know what you are, but you're not coming in." The radio hissed. Then, "You already let me in." My stomach twisted violently. A slow creak echoed through the cabin as the door nudged open just slightly. The glow from outside spilled in, illuminating the floorboards in a thin, unnatural light. I tightened my grip on the radio. "You're not real," I said, forcing the words through clenched teeth. Silence. Then A shadow moved, right outside the door. Tall, too tall, standing completely still. My breath hitched, my entire body locked. The thing outside didn't step in. It just stood there, waiting. I took a slow step back, keeping my eyes fixed on the door, my pulse hammering against my ribs. The shadow outside tilted its head, mimicking me. It had been watching. It had been learning. A slow, cold dread curled through my stomach. I turned toward the window, the reflection staring back at me in the glass. And this time, it wasn't blurred. It was me, perfectly replicated. The same features, the same expression. But it was smiling. I wasn't. I took another step back, my body trembling. Then, from the radio, "Let me in." I spun toward the door. The shadow was gone, but the door was open. The cabin shuddered. The air shifted, and I knew without a doubt something else was inside now. The door was open. Not all the way, just enough to see the black emptiness beyond it. I stood frozen, my breath shallow, my pulse hammering against my ribs. The air inside the fire tower had changed. The pressure had shifted. The silence was no longer just silence, it was occupied. Something had stepped inside. I couldn't see it, but I knew it was there. The glow outside had disappeared completely now, the flickering lights vanishing as if they had never been there at all. The forest had returned to absolute darkness. No wind, no sound, just the faint hum of the radio. I clenched my jaw, my fingers curling into fists at my sides. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. I took a slow step back, my boots scuffing against the wooden floor. The sound was too loud. The door didn't move, but something else did. A creak from the other side of the room. I whipped my flashlight toward it, my breath catching in my throat. The beam cut through the dim light, sweeping over the desk, the cot, the window. Nothing, but the floorboards had creaked, like something had shifted its weight. I tightened my grip on the flashlight, my mouth dry. My body felt wrong, off balance, disoriented, like the space around me had changed in a way I couldn't perceive. Then the radio clicked. The static came first. Then, beneath it, a sound, not words, breathing, close. I exhaled sharply, my mind screaming at me to stay in control. I stepped toward the radio, forcing myself to move slow. I didn't reach for it yet. I just listened. The breathing was steady, deliberate. It wasn't mine. I pressed the call button, my voice low. "Who is this?" The static warped. Then my own voice answered. "You? Let me in." A deep, primal horror settled into my bones. I stepped back, my stomach twisting into knots, my entire body locked in place, my fingers tingling with cold. I turned toward the door. The reflection in the window had changed. I couldn't see its face clearly, but I knew it wasn't mine. It was watching me. I took another step back, and then a whisper, right next to my ear. "It's almost time." I spun. Nothing. But the air was different now. I could feel it. A presence. Something standing right beside me. The door to the fire tower was still open, not wide, just a few inches. But now it felt like a trap, like something had been invited in. I exhaled sharply, shaking my head. No, I hadn't let it in. I hadn't opened the door. It had opened itself, and whatever was in here with me, it had been waiting for that. The door hung open just enough to see the black emptiness beyond it, a thin sliver of absolute darkness cutting through the dim light of the fire tower cabin. The air inside shifted again, pressing against me from all sides, heavier than before. I wasn't alone. I knew that now. I could feel it. Something had stepped inside. It wasn't moving anymore, but I could sense it just out of my line of sight. Watching, waiting. The breath in my lungs felt foreign, like it didn't belong to me. My body was locked in place, my pulse hammering so hard it sent sharp pains through my ribs. I didn't move, didn't speak. I was being studied. The whisper had been close, too close. Like someone had leaned in just beside my ear, their breath warm against my skin, their words curling deep into my mind like a memory I had forgotten. It's almost time. The voice had been my own. The radio clicked again. A low hum of static filled the cabin, stretching out in slow, pulsing waves. It wasn't random. It wasn't just interference. It was breathing. I turned toward the radio, my flashlight beam trembling in my grip. The static grew louder as I moved. The closer I got, the more it changed. The breaths grew deeper, heavier, like something huge was inside the frequency. Listening, I reached for the volume knob with stiff fingers, my skin damp with sweat. The plastic was cold beneath my touch, the weight of the air pressing harder against my chest. Then, a voice, so clear, so sharp, it sent an instant shock through my entire body. "You let me in." I staggered back, knocking into the chair behind me. My breath came short, uneven, my muscles locked in terror. The voice had come from the radio, but I felt it inside the room, right behind me. I didn't turn. I couldn't. I kept my eyes locked on the radio, my pulse hammering. Then, very slowly, a shadow moved across the wooden floor. I saw it, not in the room, in the window. The reflection staring back at me wasn't mine. The posture was wrong, the stance too stiff, the shoulders too squared. It was watching me, and then it smiled. The breath in my throat caught, my entire body screaming at me to move. But I was frozen in place, locked inside this nightmare, unable to react. The shadow behind me grew taller, the reflection twisted. Then the radio clicked off. Silence crashed over the room like a wave. The air around me felt thick, suffocating, alive. And then, in the reflection, the figure stepped closer. But I didn't. I stayed completely still. My mouth went dry. It was moving on its own. A horrible, dawning realization settled over me. The reflection in the window wasn't copying me anymore. It was acting on its own. I squeezed my eyes shut. My mind was breaking. There was no other explanation. I was hallucinating. The stress, the isolation, the exhaustion, it was getting to me. I inhaled sharply, forcing my breath to steady. I had to focus. When I opened my eyes again, the reflection was gone. The window was empty. I turned sharply, scanning the room, my flashlight beam sweeping across the cabin. Nothing. I was alone. Or at least, I thought I was. Then, a sound. Soft, deliberate, from inside the cabin. A single footstep. Slow, controlled, right behind me. I turned so fast I nearly dropped the flashlight. The beam swung wildly, illuminating every corner of the room. Nothing. No movement. No shadow. But I felt it. A presence. a weight in the air, pressing against me, filling every inch of the space around me. I reached for the door, my fingers shaking. I had to get out. I had to leave. Then, a knock. I jerked back, my breath catching in my throat. The knock hadn't come from the door. It had come from inside the room. A slow, steady rhythm. No, knock, no. Like something was mocking me. I pressed my back against the wall, my entire body trembling. My flashlight beam wavered, the light barely cutting through the suffocating dark. And then the door slammed shut. A rush of air sucked inward, pulling at my clothes, whipping against my skin. The force knocked me off balance, my shoulders slamming into the desk. The radio clicked on again, static. Then, my own voice. It's almost time. I squeezed my eyes shut. This wasn't happening. This wasn't happening. When I opened them again, the door was open. Not slammed, not broken, just open, like nothing had ever happened. The lights outside the tower had disappeared. The radio was silent. The air had gone still. But I knew what had just happened, and I knew I wasn't alone. I moved toward the desk, my hands stiff, my legs weak beneath me. I forced myself to sit, gripping the wooden edge so tightly my fingernails dug into the surface. I stared at the radio. I had one option. I pressed the call button, my voice hoarse. "This is Fire Tower 17. I need an immediate response." The speaker crackled, and then, in my own voice, "We haven't received any calls tonight." My stomach twisted. My hands trembled. Then, very slowly, a shadow moved in the window. I forced myself to look. The reflection was back, and this time, it was inside the cabin. The reflection in the window was inside the cabin. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My body locked in place, my fingers gripping the edge of the desk so hard they ached. My reflection stood just behind me, too still, too patient, its expression unreadable. Then it moved. Not me it. Its head tilted slightly, the way something might when observing an insect under glass. A slow, creeping horror unraveled inside me. It wasn't mimicking me anymore. It had been. At first, I had seen it copy my posture, my stance, my movements. But now, it was acting on its own. Acting first. It smiled. A slow, deliberate curl of the lips too wide, too stretched. The kind of smile a predator gives before it moves in for the kill. I swallowed hard, forcing my breath to stay steady. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. My brain was playing tricks on me. The exhaustion, the stress, the long nights alone in this tower I was breaking down. I had to be. Then the radio clicked. The static was back. The deep, slow inhale. Then, in my own voice, "Let me in." A cold wave of terror crashed over me. I spun around. Nothing. No one behind me. The cabin was empty. The reflection in the window was normal again. I was staring at my own face, my own wide, terrified eyes. My chest rose and fell rapidly. My body screamed at me to move, to get away, to leave this place and never come back. I turned back to the radio. I had to call it in. I had to get someone else on the line. I pressed the button. "Dispatch, this is Fire Tower 17. Urgent request. Do you read me?" Silence. Then, "We haven't received any calls tonight." My stomach twisted into knots. My hands shook. I took a slow step back from the desk, and then A sound, soft, deliberate, a slow, steady footstep on the wooden floor. Not from me, from behind me. My lungs locked up. I didn't turn. I couldn't. Then a voice right against my ear. "You were here before." I whipped around, flashlight raised. Nothing. The cabin was still, empty, but the air inside had changed. I could feel something was different. The space around me felt smaller. The walls seemed closer. The air thicker. The room was pressing in. I stepped back toward the desk, forcing my legs to move. I needed a plan. I needed to think. This wasn't just hallucinations. Something was happening here. I turned toward the window again, my breathing uneven. That's when I saw it. The lights were back, not floating through the trees this time, not flickering in the distance. They were at the base of the tower, and they weren't moving randomly anymore. They were moving up the stairs. My pulse spiked. I grabbed the radio again, gripping it so hard my knuckles ached. I pressed the button. "Dispatch, I need an immediate response. There is someone outside my tower. Possible intruders. Possible." I hesitated. What was I supposed to say? That I saw my own face staring at me in the window? That something was inside the cabin even though I couldn't see it? That the lights weren't just lights? No one would believe me. The radio crackled. Then, my own voice. "It's almost time." I threw the radio onto the desk, stepping back. The lights were halfway up the stairs now, their glow crawling closer. The wood creaked under their weight, under something unseen. I backed toward the door. My hand hovered over the lock. What was I supposed to do? Run? Where? Stay? And wait for whatever was climbing up those stairs to reach me. A deep, slow terror settled into my chest. The knocking had come from inside the tower earlier, but now something was coming from below. I had been trapped between them. The stairway outside groaned. One more step, then another. The lights flickered against the metal railings. I had seconds to decide. Stay and face whatever was coming up the stairs, or run into the dark. Then a whisper. "Let me in." I yanked the door open and ran. I ran out onto the deck, into the night, my boots slamming against the wooden planks. The cold air hit me like a wall, sharp and biting, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. The glow from the lights below pulsed against the trees, stretching long, flickering shadows across the ground. I didn't look, but I refused to look back. I reached the top of the stairs, my heart hammering. The lights were there, still coming up. Slow, steady. I clenched my teeth and took the risk. I jumped. The wind ripped past me as I dropped. My body slammed into the dirt, pain bursting through my shoulder. I gasped, rolling, feeling the sting of scraped skin, but I forced myself to get up. The forest loomed ahead, dark, vast, endless. I didn't think. I just ran toward it. Behind me, the fire tower stood still and empty. But the lights, the things on the stairs, they weren't empty. They were coming. The trees closed around me as I plunged into the woods, branches whipping at my arms, my legs, my face. The air smelled damp, like rain that hadn't come yet. The ground beneath my boots was uneven, slick with dead leaves and soft earth. My breath came in sharp bursts, each inhale a knife in my ribs. The radio on my shoulder bounced against me with every step. hissing with static. Then a voice. "You can't leave." I choked on my own breath. The radio was on. I hadn't touched it. I ripped it from my vest, staring at the speaker. The static stretched, warping into something almost human, something that breathed. Then, very slowly, a whisper, my own voice. "You were here before." I threw the radio into the trees. It didn't stop transmitting. Even as I kept running, even as the distance grew, I could still hear it, repeating the same words. "You were here before. You were here before. You were here before." The lights behind me flickered through the trees, moving faster now, closing in. I pushed myself forward, my lungs screaming, my muscles aching. There was no direction, no path, juiced endless blackness ahead of me. Then something changed. The air shifted. The ground beneath my feet felt different, softer. I stumbled, nearly falling. My boots sank, not into mud, not into leaves, ash. My breath caught in my throat. I looked down. The forest floor was gone, replaced by a wide, sprawling field of charred earth. Ash and dust stretched out in every direction, untouched by wind or rain, perfectly still. I took a slow step forward. My foot sank slightly, the weight of my body stirring up clouds of grey dust. A fire had burned here a long time ago, but the trees hadn't been touched. I turned in a slow circle, my pulse still racing. The lights were gone. The fire tower was gone. The radio was silent. The forest stretched empty around me. I was alone. I swallowed hard, my breath coming ragged. I had run straight into a place that shouldn't exist, and I had the overwhelming, sinking feeling that I had been here before. The clearing stretched in all directions, a vast sea of ash beneath my boots. The air here was different wrong, thick, still, like the world was holding its breath. I turned slowly, my chest rising and falling in uneven bursts. The lights were gone. The fire tower was gone. The only thing left was me, and the field of charred earth. I swallowed hard, my tongue dry. My muscles ached from the run, my lungs burned, but I forced myself to stay standing. I scanned the ground, searching for any sign of movement, any trace of footprints. Nothing. I had left no tracks. The ash hadn't shifted, hadn't disturbed beneath my weight. It was as if I had never moved at all. A slow, creeping dread curled through my stomach. This place, this clearing, I had seen it before. Not with my eyes, but in my dreams. I took a cautious step forward, the crunch of my boot the only sound in the absolute silence. The wind didn't stir here. The air didn't move. Even my breath felt wrong, like it wasn't really mine. I lifted my hand in front of my face, my fingers trembling slightly. I could see them, could feel them. My own body, my own skin. But something felt off. I wasn't supposed to be here, but I had been here before. That thought lodged itself in my brain, deep and unshakable. Then a sound, a crackle, like the last embers of a dying fire. I whipped around. Across the clearing, maybe 30 feet away, something glowed. A faint, pulsing, orange light. The ash stirred around it, shifting in slow, swirling patterns. A small flame, burning in the center of the field. Impossible. The fire was contained. It didn't spread, didn't move. It just existed. I took a step toward it, my boots pressing into the weightless dust. Every instinct in me screamed to turn around, to run. But there was nowhere else to go. I had to see. I moved forward, each step slow, deliberate. The fire flickered gently, its glow reflecting off the grey emptiness around it. Then something shifted in the flames. I froze. A shape. Something was inside. A figure, barely visible through the glow, seated in the center of the fire. Not moving. Not burning. Just waiting. My mouth went dry. I took another step forward. The figure's head lifted. A faint whisper drifted through the silence. A voice. My voice. It's almost time. The world tilted. The ground beneath me felt unsteady, unstable. The clearing seemed to stretch and distort, bending inward like I had stepped inside something that wasn't quite real. I stared back, my pulse hammering. The figure stood, slow, controlled, deliberate, and for the first time I saw its face, my own. The figure in the fire was me, not just a reflection, not a vague resemblance. Me, same uniform, same boots, same face, but its eyes hollow, empty, wrong. I took a slow, unsteady step back. My breath came in short bursts, my chest tightening, my mind breaking. This wasn't possible. This couldn't be happening. But the ash didn't lie. Neither did the fire. The figure watched me, unblinking, unmoving. The flames licked at its skin, but it didn't burn. And then it spoke, not aloud, inside me. Inside my skull, vibrating against my ribs, filling my lungs like smoke. You were here before. The words weren't new. I had heard them before, whispered through the radio, slipping through the trees. But this time I remembered. The memories slammed into me all at once, violent, suffocating. The first time, the first night, standing in this exact clearing, staring at the same impossible fire, the same impossible version of myself. 30 years ago, 40, a lifetime. I had stood here before, my boots pressed into the ash, my lungs filled with the heavy scent of something long dead. I had heard my own voice, I had seen myself, and I had forgotten. My knees nearly buckled, my hands trembled violently at my sides. I wanted to run, I wanted to escape, but there was nowhere else to go, because I had already left, I had already run, and I had always come back. The figure took a slow step toward me, the fire flickering with its movement. It's time. I shook my head, forcing myself to breathe. No, I whispered. No. The figure raised its hand, and I felt my own fingers move, like they weren't mine anymore, like my body wasn't my own. A deep, aching terror ripped through me. I wasn't real, or maybe I wasn't the first. I gasped, my vision blurring. The edges of the world flickered, warped, folded in on themselves. The trees stretched impossibly high. The sky seemed to collapse downward. The fire grew brighter, hotter, and I remembered everything. The cycles, the endless return. Every version of myself that had stood in this exact spot, staring into this exact fire, feeling the same horror, the same realization. It always ended here, no matter how far I ran, no matter how many times I tried to escape. It always ended here. The figure took another step toward me. then another. I staggered backward, my own body fighting me. My pulse slowed, my vision darkened. The weight of the air became unbearable. The fire was inside me now, burning through my veins, erasing me, taking my place. Let me in. The final whisper. I collapsed. The world tilted. The ground vanished. I woke up in Fire Tower 17. The radio crackled softly beside me, the familiar hum of static filling the cabin. I exhaled slowly, rubbing my eyes. The morning light filtered in through the window, casting a warm glow over the wooden floor. Everything was normal. My shift started soon. Another long, quiet day. I stood, stretching, feeling the soreness in my muscles from another restless night. My boots were still on. My uniform smelled faintly of smoke. I frowned. Had I been outside? I didn't remember. The radio clicked. I turned toward it. A voice whispered through the static, my own voice. There's a fire in the hills. The words sent a slow, creeping chill through me. I turned toward the window, my breath caught in my throat. The forest stretched out in all directions, endless and still, and in the distance, Fire Tower 9 stood empty. Or at least, it should have been. The radio crackled again, and then, through the static, a whisper, a voice. Help me. I smiled. The cycle began again.